It's the most influential book you've never fully read. A text so explosive, it sparked wars, built nations, and inspired everything from Michelangelo's art to Martin Luther King's dream. Yet most of us only know it in fragments, a talking snake here, a parted sea there. But the Old Testament isn't just a collection of ancient myths. It's a sweeping epic of betrayal and redemption, law and chaos, and the radical idea that one invisible God could rewrite human history. So what's really inside it? Why does it still matter? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the Old Testament, not as a dry religious manual, but as a living, breathing drama. We'll decode its hidden structure, uncover its biggest themes, and relive the stories that shaped the world. Because whether you believe it's divine or simply groundbreaking literature, this is the book that taught us how to hope. It's not just a religious book, it's the foundation of Western thought. But to understand its power, we need to start with the basics. What exactly is the Old Testament? Before we dive into its epic stories and timeless themes, let's answer the most basic question: what exactly is the Old Testament? At its core, it's the first and oldest section of the Christian Bible, but its roots go even deeper. For Jewish tradition, these same scriptures are known as the Tanakh, the sacred foundation of faith. And here's where things get fascinating: not every Old Testament is the same. Protestant Bibles contain 39 books, while Catholic and Orthodox versions include additional writings like Tobit and Maccabees. And the original text? Mostly written in ancient Hebrew, with a few passages in Aramaic, the language of empires, the vernacular of exile. But no matter how you count them, these aren't just ancient documents. They're a library, a collection of history, poetry, law, and prophecy, woven together across centuries. Think of it as part origin story, part legal code, part divine drama, with humanity caught in the middle. So why does this matter? Because the Old Testament isn't a monolith, it's a conversation. A debate between justice and mercy, between kings and prophets, between a nation's failures and its future hope. And that conversation begins with the very first word, in the beginning. Now that we've defined this ancient library, let's unpack how it's organized, because the Old Testament's structure holds hidden meaning in how its stories unfold. Imagine holding not just a book, but an entire library in your hands, a collection of scrolls written across 1,000 years, in deserts and palaces, in times of triumph and exile. The Old Testament isn't a single narrative, it's a tapestry, where history, poetry, law, and prophecy intertwine to tell one of humanity's most enduring stories. To truly grasp its power, we need to step back and see how it all fits together. It begins with the 5 books known as the Pentateuch, or in Hebrew, the Torah. These are the foundation, the origin story of everything that follows. Genesis opens with the cosmos itself bursting into being, the creation of humanity, and the fateful choice that fractures paradise. Then comes the calling of Abraham, the father of nations, whose descendants will carry a divine promise through centuries of slavery and deliverance. Exodus sweeps us into the drama of Moses, the plagues of Egypt, and the miraculous escape through the Red Sea, culminating in the thunderous revelation at Mount Sinai, where God hands down the 10 Commandments. The next 3 books, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, might seem like ancient legal codes to modern readers, but for Israel, they were revolutionary. These laws shaped a people who had just emerged from slavery into a nation with a moral compass, a system of justice, and a vision of holiness. From there, the story shifts to the historical books. A saga of conquest, kings, and crushing defeats. Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land, but the victory is far from clean. Judges paints a chaotic, often brutal picture of tribal leaders like Samson and Deborah holding the line against enemies and internal decay. Then comes the rise of the monarchy, Saul, the troubled first king, David, the warrior poet who unites the tribes but whose flaws nearly destroy him, and Solomon, whose wisdom builds the glorious temple in Jerusalem, but whose pride leads to the kingdom's division. The books of Kings and Chronicles trace the tragic unraveling, the northern kingdom of Israel falling to Assyria, the southern kingdom of Judah crumbling under Babylon's might, the temple reduced to rubble, and the people dragged into exile. But even in the ruins, hope flickers. Ezra and Nehemiah tell of the return, the rebuilding, the stubborn resilience of a people who refuse to let their story end. Then, like a pause in the storm, the Old Testament turns inward. The books of poetry and wisdom give voice to the human heart in all its complexity. Job cries out against the injustice of his suffering, demanding answers from God. The Psalms pour out every emotion, despair, rage, joy, gratitude, in lyrics that have comforted millions across millennia. Proverbs distills lifetimes of hard-won wisdom into sharp, memorable sayings. Ecclesiastes stares into the void and asks whether any of it really matters, while the Song of Solomon celebrates love in language so lush it's been read as both romance and divine allegory. These aren't just ancient texts, they're mirrors, reflecting our own doubts, longings, and moments of transcendence. Finally, the prophets rise like a chorus of warning and hope. Isaiah's soaring visions promise a suffering servant who will bear the world's pain. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, watches Jerusalem burn and insists even exile isn't the end. Ezekiel sees a valley of dry bones shudder back to life. The minor prophets, Hosea, Amos, Jonah, and the rest may be brief, but their messages are explosive. They confront corrupt kings, expose societal injustice, and whisper of a future where light breaks through the darkness. Malachi, the last voice in the Old Testament, leaves us with a promise: the dawn is coming. It's worth noting that Jewish tradition organizes these same scriptures differently, into the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. The books are the same, but the arrangement shifts the emphasis, reminding us that this is a living text, still speaking in multiple ways. What's astonishing is how deliberately this library was assembled. The Old Testament isn't a random pile of scrolls, it's a journey, from creation to covenant, from kingdom to exile, from lament to hope. And now that we've seen the structure, we're ready to explore the great themes that pulse through it all. But these aren't just disconnected books. They're threads in a grand tapestry. To truly grasp the Old Testament, we need to trace its recurring themes that pulse through every story. Beneath the surface of these ancient stories, behind the battles and prophecies, the laws and poetry, pulse powerful themes that have shaped civilizations. These aren't mere historical footnotes, they're the beating heart of the text, ideas so revolutionary they shattered ancient worldviews and continue to challenge us today. At the core stands the radical concept of covenant. This isn't contract law, it's a sacred bond, a promise etched in history when God calls a wandering Aramean named Abraham and pledges to make his descendants a blessing to all nations. That promise echoes through time, to Moses at the burning bush, to David in his palace, through every prophet's warning. It's a divine commitment that survives betrayal, exile, and human failure, the stubborn insistence that relationship matters more than perfection. Running parallel is the theme of law as liberation. At Sinai, when God hands down commandments to former slaves, it's not about restriction but about creating a society where no one would be enslaved again. Love your neighbor isn't postscript, it's revolutionary social legislation in a world where power meant privilege. The purity codes, so strange to modern ears, were actually a radical declaration: every part of life, food, sex, economics, matters to God. Yet the text never flinches from showing how often this vision fails. The theme of exile isn't just about Babylon, it's the human condition. Adam and Eve exiled from Eden. Jacob fleeing his homeland. Joseph sold into slavery. The prophets named this truth: we're always wandering from home, from each other, from our best selves. But with every exile comes the counter-theme of return, the persistent promise that no failure is final, no distance too great for redemption. Woven throughout is the quiet drumbeat of messianic hope. It begins subtly, a promise that Eve's offspring will crush the serpent's head. It grows in David's flawed kingship. It burns bright in Isaiah's suffering servant who bears the sins of many. This isn't wishful thinking, it's the conviction that history is going somewhere, that oppression won't have the last word. Perhaps most striking is the Old Testament's portrayal of God, neither distant force nor tribal deity, but a being of terrifying holiness and intimate compassion. This God storms battlefields and whispers to Elijah in silence. Demands justice and clothes the naked. Judges nations and collects human tears in a bottle. The tension is deliberate, we're meant to wrestle with this paradox of power and tenderness. These themes don't resolve neatly. They argue with each other across centuries, just as Jacob wrestled the angel, and like Jacob, we come away from the struggle both wounded and blessed, bearing new understanding of what it means to be human before the divine. These themes come alive in the text's most pivotal moments. Let's step into the stories themselves, the clashes, the miracles, and the raw humanity that make these ancient accounts timeless. If the Old Testament were an epic film, these would be its climactic scenes, the moments where heaven and earth collide, where ordinary people find themselves swept into extraordinary encounters with the divine. These aren't just ancient myths, they're the hinges on which history turns, stories so powerful they've shaped art, law, and the very way we understand what it means to be human. It all begins, of course, with creation itself, not a scientific textbook, but a poetic declaration that the world is intentional, beautiful, and charged with meaning. In the beginning, God, with those words, the universe bursts forth from darkness, land separating from sea, life springing up at the command of a voice. And at the climax, humanity. Mold from earth, animated by divine breath, placed in a garden where they walk with God in the cool of the day. But then, the fracture. A forbidden fruit, a whispered lie, and suddenly the first couple are sewing fig leaves together, hiding among trees that once gave them joy. The tragedy isn't just disobedience, it's the shattering of intimacy, the birth of shame. From there, the story spirals, Cain's murder of Abel, humanity's descent into violence until God grieves over creation itself. The flood comes, not as blind wrath but as a terrible mercy, washing clean a world rotten with corruption. Yet even here, grace survives, in an ark, in a rainbow, in the stubborn promise that God will never again destroy the earth this way. Then comes Abraham, called from his homeland with an impossible promise, I will make you a great nation. At 100 years old, he's still childless, yet he believes. And that faith is tested to the breaking point when God asks him to sacrifice Isaac, the son of the promise. The knife is raised, and then stopped. Here we learn something staggering about the God of the Old Testament. He provides the sacrifice himself. Centuries later, Abraham's descendants are slaves in Egypt, crying out under the lash, until Moses, the reluctant deliverer, stands before Pharaoh with nothing but a staff and a promise, let my people go. 10 plagues later, the Red Sea parts, the armies drown, and a nation of former slaves dances on the far shore. At Sinai, thunder rolls as God carves his law into stone, not just rules, but the constitution of a new kind of society. But freedom proves fragile. The wilderness generation complains, rebels, and wanders for 40 years. Joshua leads them into Canaan, but the conquest is messy, morally ambiguous, a theme that continues through the era of Judges, where heroes like Samson are as flawed as they are strong. Then comes David. Shepherd boy, giant slayer, king. He unites the tribes, write psalms that give voice to every human emotion, yet falls spectacularly: adultery, murder, a family torn apart by his own sins. Still, God calls him a man after my own heart, not because he's perfect, but because he keeps returning, repentant. The kingdom splits, prophets rise, and despite warnings, Israel spirals into idolatry. Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel in a fiery showdown. Isaiah sees God in the temple, so holy that the foundations shake. Jeremiah weeps as Jerusalem burns. The people are dragged to Babylon, where Daniel faces lions and Ezekiel sees visions of dry bones coming to life. Then, the surprise ending. After 70 years, a remnant returns. The temple is rebuilt, not as grand as before, but standing nonetheless. The story doesn't tie up neatly. The last prophets speak of a coming day when God will make all things new. These stories aren't morality tales. They're raw, unfiltered encounters with a God who refuses to give up on humanity. And that's why, thousands of years later, they still have the power to wreck us, remake us, and draw us into the greatest story ever told. After walking through these world-shaping events, one question remains: why should any of this matter to us today? The answer lies in how these ancient words still shape our minds, our laws, and our very souls. Think of the Old Testament as an ancient river that still waters the modern world. Its currents run deeper than we realize, shaping everything from our laws to our art to the way we wrestle with life's biggest questions. This isn't just a relic of antiquity, it's the bedrock of how we think about justice, power, and what it means to be human. Take the idea that every person carries divine worth. When Genesis declares humans are made in the image of God, it planted a seed that would take millennia to fully grow, but once it took root, it changed everything. That single concept would eventually undermine slavery, inspire civil rights movements, and form the moral foundation for human dignity. The prophets amplified it, shouting against corruption and greed, insisting that a society is judged by how it treats its weakest members. Amos' cry for justice to roll down like waters still echoes in courthouses and protests today. Then there's the raw honesty of these texts. Unlike the heroic myths of other ancient cultures, the Old Testament shows its champions flawed and broken. Abraham doubts. Moses stutters. David, the greatest king, becomes an adulterer and murderer. These aren't marble statues of perfection, they're flesh and blood people, as tangled and contradictory as we are. When we see Jacob wrestling with God or Naomi raging at her emptiness, we recognize ourselves. The text gives us permission to bring our full selves, our anger, our doubts, our failures, into the conversation with the divine. Even if you've never read a page of scripture, you've absorbed its language. When we talk about the writing on the wall or a voice crying in the wilderness, we're quoting Daniel and Isaiah. Shakespeare's plays, Michelangelo's frescoes, spirituals sung by enslaved people, the speeches of Lincoln and King, they all draw from this well. The Psalms alone have given words to more joy and grief than any other poetry in history. But perhaps its greatest gift is the way it refuses easy answers. The Old Testament doesn't tidy up suffering with platitudes. Job screams at God without punishment. Ecclesiastes stares into the void and admits life sometimes feels meaningless. Lamentations weeps over ruins without rushing to hope. In an age of shallow optimism and performative positivity, these ancient voices give us permission to be human, to question, to grieve, to sit in the ashes while still holding out for dawn. And that's why this text endures. Not because it's simple, but because it's true. Not because it's safe, but because it's alive. Whether you approach it as scripture or literature, the Old Testament remains the record of a people, and through them, all of us, grappling with the deepest mysteries. Why are we here? What does justice demand? How do we hold on to hope when the world burns? The answers it offers aren't neat, but they're real. And 3,000 years later, we're still part of that conversation. Which brings us to the final revelation: the Old Testament isn't just a relic to study. It's an invitation to join a conversation that's been raging for millennia. So here we stand at the end of our journey, or perhaps, at the beginning. Because the Old Testament isn't meant to be neatly summarized and shelved away. It's a story that continues to unfold, a conversation spanning millennia that we're now part of. From the first words of Genesis to the final promises of Malachi, we've seen how this ancient text pulses with life. How its stories of creation and catastrophe, its cries of lament and bursts of joy, its stern demands for justice and tender offers of mercy, all converge into something far greater than history. This is the record of humanity's oldest and most persistent questions: who are we? Why is there suffering? What does God want from us? The answers it gives are rarely simple. A God who drowns the world in judgment but preserves Noah. A promise to Abraham that blesses all nations through a people who constantly fail. Laws that demand perfection paired with stories that celebrate redemption for the imperfect. This tension isn't a flaw, it's the text's greatest strength. The Old Testament refuses to let us reduce life, or God, to easy formulas. And that's why it still speaks. When we see corruption in high places, we hear Amos roaring against injustice. When we feel abandoned, we join the Psalms in their raw honesty. When we long for a better world, Isaiah's visions of peace still stir our hopes. These aren't dusty relics, they're mirrors showing us ourselves, and windows into something beyond us. So whether you read these texts as sacred scripture or as humanity's cultural inheritance, one truth remains: the Old Testament endures because it's honest about how hard it is to be human, and how relentless divine love can be. It's the story of a God who keeps calling, and a people, and through them, all of us, who keep responding, generation after generation. The final word isn't really Malachi's prophecy. It's the question the text leaves echoing in our hearts: what will you do with this story now? If you want to keep exploring these ancient texts with fresh eyes, hit subscribe to Book Therapy. We're just getting started.